Hello and welcome to Adventures in Journalism. I'm Martin Hesp. If you picked up the Western Morning News or the Western Daily Press on a Saturday morning, any time in the last quarter of a century, you'll likely have seen my name. Since the year 2000, and actually going back even further in various roles since I started in this trade as a 17-year-old in 1973, I've been documenting the soul of the West Country. But it was that move to the Western Morning News at the turn of the millennium that really set the pace. Since then, through the merger of the feature departments of the WMN and the Western Daily Press, I have been the eyes and ears for a great many West Country people out there on the ground, anywhere between the Cotswolds and Land's End, or even further, the Isles of Scilly. I sat down recently to do some sums, and they're quite startling. Every week for 26 years I've produced a 900-word column, an opinion column, which you may have seen. And when you factor in the features and the Hesp out west travels, we aren't just talking about a career, it's almost turned into a complete library. When you factor in the many features I've written for the two papers, like the walks I did for 20 years, and nowadays the Hesp out west travel column, and also all the various food features I've written over the years, we aren't just talking about a career. We're talking about a complete library. Altogether, it's way over 2 million words I've written, and 1.17 million words written specifically for my Saturday readers in the opinion column. If I think about that for a second, that's more than 10 times the length of a hefty novel, all dedicated to the farmers, the fishermen, the cider makers, and the sheer rugged beauty of our peninsula, just to name a few things there. I spent a lifetime as a senior feature writer, a title that basically gave me a license to be curious. And I've been an editor at large, which really meant I was a man with a notebook and a tape recorder roaming from the Somerset levels to the edges of the Atlantic. Actually, what editor at large really means is you're an awkward old bugger that no one in the head office knows what to do with, so they're quite glad not to see you and to hope you'll keep writing plenty of words, which is what I always did. I never worked from the company head office. I used to visit the Western Morning News HQ in Plymouth about once a year at most, and no one ever complained. And they wouldn't, because I happen to know, because someone told me, that for many years I filed more words than any other journalist or reporter on the paper. And, that's not a boast, it just happens to be true. And I think that's what can happen if you're sitting in a lonely garret here on Exmoor with no one to talk to or put your mind off the writing that you're meant to be doing. And here's the rub. Many of you who have followed me in print since 1999 are part of a traditional rural readership. You're the sort of people who like the feel of newsprint between your fingers. Transitioning that loyal audience into a digital space, for instance to this podcast and to my food and travel website, is a bit of a challenge. It's a leap from the physical world of the 20th century into the digital airwaves of the 21st. So in this episode of Adventures in Journalism, I'm going to have a go at reading out the opinion piece that was in last Saturday's papers. When I was growing up in West Somerset, the word war was never far from people's lips, especially us boys. 2/3 of our teachers had fought in World War II, and some had physical wounds to prove it. I remember one bloke with a blooming great big dent in the side of his head. Poor chap. Most of the male teachers seemed to bear some form of mental anguish. And of course, there wasn't any counselling back then, and the term post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, had not been invented. But looking back, I'm sure some of those angst-ridden chaps really were suffering quite badly. In the 1950s and 60s, when I was a lad, no one talked about World War II. It was simply the war, presumably because the horrors and the stresses and strains of living through it still remained strong in the minds of everyone aged over the age of 18. Now, 60 years later, people are talking about war again. It's not here. We cannot hear the crump of explosives or feel any real sense of fear, but we are aware that it's happening. We probably know someone who is out in the Gulf at the moment, stuck out there like so many are, or perhaps we are keeping an eye on those prices at the fuel pump in the certain knowledge they will rise. I was in Taunton yesterday and I saw that a litre of diesel had gone up to £1.57, and someone I met told me that down in Cornwall it had reached £1.67. But that's a very soft way of looking at war, because it is terrible, horrible, scary. What else can one say about war? As a West Country newspaper columnist, I cannot claim to have any special knowledge or wisdom which would help throw a useful light on the present conflict, one way or another. I've travelled extensively in the region, been to Amman 3 times, in fact, and I do think the so-called clerics who ran things in Iran were an awful bunch and that they were a threat to the entire Middle East. But I also see TV footage of a bombed-out school in Iran, and words fail me. The Israeli government seems to think it's above international law. As for Trump, if ever there was a man without a plan, whichever way you look at it, bang goes his Peace Prize. Sometimes when we mere mortals see something vast occurring on the world stage, all we can do is internalise our emotions and remember what certain themes have meant to us in the past. Even though it was spoken about a lot, war didn't bother us West Country boys all those years ago. In fact, we liked the sound of it. We bought comics that featured it, spent our money on Airfix models of Spitfires and Hurricanes and Lancaster bombers and the like, and we never tired of watching war movies. Me and my village pals didn't have to go far to know that war was a reality. Just opposite our school there was a field called Battlegore. Still is called Battlegore as far as I know. Anyway, it had been excavated by the same archaeologist who'd uncovered the Glastonbury Lake Village, and apart from human remains, he found several bronze items, including a knife dagger, a winged axe, a spearhead dated from between 1500 and 1000 BC, bones and weapons. No wonder it was called Battlegore. But those finds pointed to a story much older than the local legend, which declared the field had been the site of a bloody engagement between marauding Danes and local men. Indeed, in 914 or 918 AD, the dates vary by Norse chronicle, a Viking fleet did land just a mile or so away. Jarls Alter and Hrold came ashore with a plan to pillage the mint at Watchet and the royal estate at Willerton. However, the local Saxon fyrd, or militia, was ready and waiting, and they duffed up the invaders so badly the few survivors who did manage to come away from it were forced to retreat fast to their boats. Not that the escape did them much good. They made their way across the Bristol Channel to the islands of Steepholm or Flatholm, where they apparently starved to death. So we boys were hugely impressed by our community's own history, all that glorious violence and fighting. We liked talking about war, so we'd ask our teachers about the things they'd seen, and we couldn't understand when a faraway look would cross their faces and they'd fall into silence. "What was it like, sir, shooting someone? What was it like?" Most of them were not good teachers, it has to be said. They even managed to make the excellent local story about King Alfred burning the cakes uninteresting. The Vikings were trying to pin Alfred down in a pincer movement. From the east, their main army, under Guthrum, spent a winter hunting Alfred through the Somerset marshes. They knew he was there, but the wetlands were a natural fortress that the Vikings were unable to penetrate. In the west, another Viking warlord, Ubba, was sent to cut off Alfred's potential escape down into Devon or Cornwall. That part of the plan did not end well. In fact, I've always thought the siege of Countisbury Hill must be one of the most cinematic moments in English history. Hubba's men chased a gang of local warriors up to the hill fort high above Lynmouth and duly surrounded it. As the fort had no supply of water, all Hubba had to do was wait for the Saxons to surrender or die of thirst. However, realizing they were doomed, the local guys burst out in a desperate all-or-nothing charge. And it was a good move. They didn't just overpower Hubba, they slaughtered him and between 800 and 1,200 of his men. Yeah, well, now I've become so excited scribing all this, I've forgotten why I started writing about war in the first place. That's it. Gung-ho shooting matches, decided upon by a handful of bombastic, overly powerful men. And it is men, isn't it? Not women. That kind of thing belongs in the history books. It really does. We should have learned that lesson long, long ago. So that's my column for this weekend. Been seen in the papers? Now you've heard it here. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week.